Welcome to this special interview that I will be conducting with Holly Ordway, author of a new biography of Tolkien. My name is Michael Ward. I'm a friend of Word on Fire. I'm a Word on Fire author, and it's my great privilege to speak to my friend and colleague, Holly Ordway, about her new book, Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography. It's coming out in late August 2023. To mark the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. It is a fantastic addition to Tolkien scholarship. I can say that quite honestly and objectively. I would say this if Holly was a complete stranger to me. It's opened my eyes to a whole new dimension of Tolkien's life and personality. But my first question to you, Holly, is why is this biography needed? Don't we already know about Tolkien's faith? So why write a book called Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography?
Well, this book came about really in part from my own discovery as I studied Tolkien, as I've been reading and thinking and writing about Tolkien for getting on to over 30 years now. And I realized that it's pretty widely known that he was a Christian, but the details of it, the texture, the nuance of it were not available. They were not in any of the available biographies. So, for instance, Humphrey Carpenter's authorized biography is very clear that he is a Christian and that his faith was important to him. But Carpenter presents it really as an emotional attachment. He grounds it pretty much completely in his love for his mother and his attachment to his mother's faith. And I realized as I was doing my research that that's not complete. That's really not the whole picture. Another biographer, Raymond Edwards, in his biography, literally relegates all discussion of Tolkien's faith to an appendix. Literally, there's just an appendix called his faith. And that gives the impression that Tolkien compartmentalized his faith and that it was just one thing that he did apart from the rest of his life as an author, as a scholar, as a friend, as a father. And that also is something that I discovered is absolutely not the case. His faith, as attested to by his family, his friends, and his own many, many statements, was really integrated to everything that he did. And as I followed up on that, I started looking for what did his life of faith look like in practice. I started to discover that, in fact, it was really interwoven with everything that he did, including as a writer and as an academic. And it wasn't just a private conviction. And so it became really clear to me that I needed to write a book that would account for that would give the complete picture.
Yes, and I think you have succeeded marvelously because, I have read all the biographies that there are already of Tolkien, and I consider myself to be reasonably expert in Tolkien's life and works. But as I say, your book opened my eyes to a whole new perspective on him as someone whose faith really was central, lifelong, integrated, touched every part of his life. I actually found it quite an inspiring and edifying work. It's not a work of hagiography. You're not saying that Tolkien was a saint. It's a warts and all portrait. But nonetheless, his example is pretty inspiring. And I'm not alone in this. John Garth, the great Tolkien scholar whose book Tolkien and the Great War everybody should read, he has also read this book in preparation for its publication, and he too has said that he learned more reading this book than he even knew he needed to learn. And that's from John Garth. So this just shows how deep your scholarship has gone, how much research you've done. It's a really fantastic achievement, especially given that you've written it in basically 2 years, because it was only 2 years ago that your last book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, came out. So I just wonder, from your point of view, what novelty, what new things, what freshness do you think this biography is principally bringing to the table?
Well, for me, the thing that stands out is a theme that ends up running through much of Tolkien's faith, and that is the influence of the oratorians on Tolkien. Because most people who are familiar with Tolkien's biography, at least to a certain degree, know that he was orphaned at age 12 and that he was raised by a Catholic priest, Father Francis Morgan, of the Birmingham Oratory. But I think that most people think of the Birmingham Oratory as just the name of a church building, and they don't realize the larger significance, which is that it's an oratory in the Congregation of the Oratory of St. Philip Neri, which was founded in Birmingham by John Henry Newman, and that the oratory, the Congregation of the Oratory, has its own distinctive spirituality, and that Tolkien's, his earliest years were already involved with the oratory because of his mother's, moving to become part of that parish. But he spent 7 years of his most formative part of his life literally being raised. He calls himself a junior member of the oratory house. And he calls it a home in excelsis, a home in the highest. So he has the warmest praise for this place that he grew up, where he's mentored not just by Father Francis, his second father, but he's part of what he called a whole community of learned fathers. There were many Oratorian priests. Most of them were converts from Anglicanism, like he was and his mother. They were learned men. They wrote books. The oratory was a place of beauty, of music, of emphasis in education. And the more I delved into Tolkien's involvement with the Oratorians, the more I saw how pivotal their influence was on him, on shaping his education, on shaping his taste, as well as shaping his faith life. And that, I think, is really eye-opening. I think it helps us understand a lot about Tolkien himself, about the way that he was a man of profound sorrows at many times. He had a very depressive streak, but we also see that he was also a very joyful man, often very silly by his own account, full of joy, full of laughter. And this can seem quite contradictory in the face of it. But perhaps one of the most intriguing things I found out was that this is actually a key characteristic of Oratorian spirituality. And that brings a coherence to an element of Tolkien's personality that I had always found rather mysterious.
Yeah, so the oratory was founded in the 16th century by St. Philip Neri, who's described sometimes as the third apostle of Rome after St. Peter and St. Paul. And just tell us a little bit about St. Philip and how he bred into the congregation of the oratory this particular charism, you might say, or at any rate, this kind of spiritual temperament.
Well, he was, as you know, he was a 16th century Italian. He went to Rome and was convicted that he needed to help, the city, which was very corrupt, to rediscover its Christian faith, to become more moral, to be revitalized. But he didn't do it by going around preaching with a long face. He founded these oratories, which were places where he invited young men to come and gather for conversation, for fellowship, for musical evenings. That's actually where we get the term oratorio. It was originally a musical composition played at the oratory. And he taught them how to pray in a very sort of down-to-earth way. And he emphasized a couple of things. One was he emphasized humility, that there should be this down-to-earth quality in their faith. And also he emphasized humor. There's a great story about St. Philip that he once got invited to a really posh party by one of the wealthiest men in Rome. And he showed up with half of his beard shaved off so that he looked like a complete idiot. Now, why did he do that? It was very silly, but it had a serious spiritual purpose, which is that he figured out that this host was not really being pious. He was just trying to show off, look at how great I am. I can get the holiest man in Rome to come to my dinner party. So he makes himself look foolish to show up the sort of triviality of that. But he always took his faith seriously, his teaching, his preaching, his care for the poor. And I think we see that in the oratory, and that emphasis on playfulness as a way to keep yourself kind of down to earth, grounded, so that then you can live out your Christian life in a realistic way, in a way that isn't all puffed up and prideful.
Yeah, and you show how this affects Tolkien's own growing temperament and personality, his own love of fun, his own self-deprecating wit, and how eventually it will inform his depiction of the hobbits, who are almost literally down to earth because they're so short and they live in holes in the ground. So that's a very, very interesting connection between Philippine, St. Philip Neri's spirituality and Tolkien and his works. But you found something even more specific than that, haven't you? In that, tell us about Tolkien's confirmation name.
Yes, and this is extremely interesting. Now, Catholics, when they're confirmed, as Tolkien was at age 11, almost 12, they take a patron saint, and they take that as a saint's name. And he took the name Philip. Now, which Philip, though? Which Philip could it be? And I was able to determine, actually checked with Priscilla Tolkien himself, the great man's daughter, and the particular Philip that he took as his confirmation saint was Philip Neri. So he took that as a name. And it turns out that he really did consider that to be one of his names. There's in the 1930s, he does some elvish doodles where he's listing all the names of his family members, and he writes his own name as John Ronald Philip Reuel Tolkien. It's part of his name. And I would believe, and this is something that actually you pointed out to me first, and I was immediately struck and convinced by it. If you look at the famous monogram, we can see the J, the two R's, we see the T over the top, but there's a little spur on the side that really serves no particular purpose in the balance of the monogram. But if you realize that it stands for the P, it's signaling the presence of the P, which shares the loop of the R, but that little asymmetrical spur is indicating it's John Ronald Philip Reuel Tolkien. And as soon as you see it, you can recognize why else would there be this asymmetrical element in a most beautifully polished and carefully composed monogram. And I think that's an indication of how important it was to him. And I think it's worth noting that in the very earliest uses of his monogram in signing his early sketches, that little spur doesn't appear, but it starts to appear a little bit later and then continues through the rest of his life, which is absolutely consistent with the fact that first he took the name as his patron saint, and only a few years later, as he matures, he starts to really feel the connection and feel the importance of it. And then the P appears. And this is actually very much in line with the spirituality of St. Philip Neri, because he was all about hiddenness, humility, and playfulness. And what could be more playfully hidden than hiding the Philip in plain sight? It's very Tolkienian.
Yes. Well, you told me about his interest in St. Philip and the Oratorian influence, and I think told me that he had taken the name at his confirmation. And then it occurred to me, maybe there's the P hidden in the monogram. And then together we had that conversation in Oxford with Priscilla Tolkien, his daughter, in which you asked her, is it indeed Philip Neri? And she confirmed that it was. And then you've taken this and run with it, really interestingly pointing out how, the very name Philip means horse lover, Philippos in Greek. And in some of Tolkien's works, he talks about, he mentions that, Philip has this meaning, and it's not just a lover of horses, but a kind of, by extension, a lover of horse play, careering about. I mean, think of prancing ponies and the marvelous playfulness that there is in The Hobbit particularly, but also in elements of The Lord of the Rings and in Tolkien's own life. And it's all rooted back into his confirmation saint in his religious upbringing under an Oratorian priest. And suddenly all this new insight accumulates around one single discovery. That's one of the beautiful things about the book. But anyway, I mustn't start expatiating too much on how I think this book is going to transform Tolkien scholarship, but it is going to. But we just enter a caution here that, of course, a lot of Tolkien readers are not Christians, are not Catholics. And yet this book is not written particularly aimed at Catholics or Christians. It's for a general audience. It's written with an academic tone. It's being published by Word on Fire Academic. It's got thousands of footnotes. It's got several appendices. We'll come back to those in a moment, perhaps. But just say a little bit, if you would, about how you hope that non-Christians or non-Catholics might receive what you have discovered. Why should they be interested?
Well, I think fundamentally they should be interested because Tolkien was a very interesting man. He's interesting as a person because it's from his own creative imagination that we get these marvelous works. So I think it's quite a natural impulse and a good impulse that if we love his works, we're moved by them, we're engaged by them, that we want to know something about the mind that created them. And Tolkien himself said repeatedly in public interviews, in private conversations, in letters, in his writings, he identified himself as a Christian and specifically as a devout Catholic Christian. So Tolkien himself, in various places, identifies his Christian faith as foundational, as the most important factor in his writings. Although at the same time, he's very careful to say that he is not explicitly putting Christian elements, religious elements into works like Lord of the Rings. But he's very clear that they're there. They're just not overt. They're not the details. So I think it's a very natural impulse to say, well, if it mattered to Tolkien, then I think it should matter to us. In much the same way that we understand that he was grounded in the context of Oxford, England, and the academic scene, most readers are not academics. They're not scholars. They're readers of his work. And even the ones who are scholars, most of them are never going to visit Oxford or work there. But that doesn't mean that we don't care about what his life was like in Oxford. And I think it's exactly the same thing with his faith. Regardless of whether a reader has a different faith or no faith at all, it was important to Tolkien. And so I think we want to understand it so that we can better understand this marvelous imaginative creation that he's made in his world. And I also think that really going in depth into what did he believe, why did it matter to him, is important in a couple of other ways. One is that I think it can dispel some sort of needless anxiety. I think sometimes, and I particularly resonate with this because I'm a convert myself. I wasn't always a Christian, but I loved Tolkien long before I was a Christian. And I can remember a certain sort of nervousness, like, well, this figure, I don't believe what he believes. Does he think that, that I'm going to hell? Is he a bigot? Am I going to be finding skeletons in the closet when I look into this that's going to make me feel uncomfortable with his writings? And the answer is no. He was a very big-hearted Christian. He was very secure in his own beliefs, and he believed them to be true. But he did not foist them on anybody. He was very generous in his attitudes. He had many friends who were not Catholics, who were not Christians. And I think it's a great reassurance to know that in black and white. We need not fear that we're going to be uncomfortable with our favorite author because we learn about this faith that he had. So I think that's an important point. But the other point is that, because his faith is so central to him, he's constantly making reference to things like in the letters. The letters are full of references that he takes for granted about the Eucharist, about his devotions, about prayers, about all sorts of things that are pretty much incomprehensible for an outside reader. And one of my major goals for Tolkien's faith was to make this comprehensible, to be a guide, so that now when people turn to, say, the letters and they see him, for instance, talking about the Eucharist, they can actually know what it is that he means when he talks about, say, the Blessed Sacrament as the one great thing to love on earth. It's a very strong statement. It's often quoted. But what does he mean by that? And that's something that I dig into. And I don't expect my readers to have any background information. So I give a whole glossary at the end. There's no reason to expect that people should know. Why should they? So I have not expected that. And there's a glossary in the back with loads of terms, many of which turn up in his letters. And now readers will be just better equipped to understand what their favorite author is saying in his own words.
Yeah, no, it's really informative. Even for someone like me, who I'm a lifetime Christian, I'm a Catholic. Indeed, I'm a Catholic priest, though I'm not dressed like one today. And yet there are some very obscure things in Tolkien's letters, which you helpfully unpack. So it's just, I think, useful. Let's put it no higher than that. Everybody who reads Tolkien needs to understand what he's talking about in his letters, and rather than just glossing over them, you are literally glossing them in order to explain. So that's a fantastic aspect of the book too, I think. So we've touched upon this fact that Tolkien was a man of great faith, a great Catholic, although raised for the first 8 years of his life as an Anglican until his mother converted, and then he was confirmed when he was 11. Your second chapter is called Two Worlds, and that's a recurring theme throughout the story of his life, really, how the two worlds being the Anglican world and the Catholic world, because England was then, still is, an Anglican culture. It has an established church. The head of state, the monarch, is the supreme governor of the Church of England. And so Tolkien, to a certain extent, found himself, when he became a Catholic, on the sharp end of this division, this polarity in British culture, or English culture, we should specify. So give us a few examples of how Tolkien, as it were, suffered when he became a Catholic, how he had to battle against certain prejudices deep built into English society.
Well, this is an important theme in the whole book, because one of the things that I discovered, really to my surprise, in doing the deep research for Tolkien's faith, was really how deeply anti-Catholic English culture was at the time that Tolkien was growing up. And this is a case of putting ourselves in the right sort of chronological, historical, cultural context, because England is not that way now. This is a very good thing. Things have changed. But it certainly was then. And especially for American readers of Tolkien, even if you are an American Catholic, that experience is radically different from English Catholicism. And English Catholicism is rooted in the fact that at the Reformation, Henry VIII, separated the entire, his entire kingdom from obedience to the Pope and declared himself to be the supreme governor of the church. And that's why Sir Thomas More lost his head, because he wouldn't agree to that, and he was beheaded. And this was a saint whom Tolkien admired greatly. And so for 2 centuries, Catholics were a literally disenfranchised minority. In fact, for the first, part of that 2 centuries, it was illegal to be a Catholic. Not just illegal to preach about it, but there were raids carried out in private homes. You could be imprisoned or even executed for owning a rosary. It was an absolutely crushing time of injustice, really, for the Catholic population. And these penal laws, as they were called, were gradually eased off, but gradually and with resistance. In the mid-1800s, when the very first of the Catholic Relief Acts was passed, they wanted to give Catholics the vote. The 1820s, and Catholics could not vote, simply because they were Catholic. And there were riots. There were actually riots in the street against Catholics getting the vote. This is remarkable. So gradually the restrictions are lifted, but in fact, even into Tolkien's adulthood, it wasn't until he was an adult that the very last of the penal laws was passed. Until then, until the 1920s, it was possible for the state to confiscate any bequests that were given to Catholic institutions on the grounds that they were for superstitious uses. Now, whether or not that happened very often is a different question, but it was the law that was, again, not giving Catholics the full civil rights of their Anglican neighbors. So that's the legal, even, and cultural environment in which Tolkien was in. And what that meant in practical terms was that there were more limited employment options for Catholics. And there was also a history of, well, we're not quite keen on having Catholics for this post. Tolkien himself, one time at a dinner, a high table at one of the Oxford colleges, had his neighbor say, "Oh, well, it's a good thing they didn't, get a Catholic for that post at the college. That would have been disastrous." Just saying it right out on the table with a Catholic sitting right next to him. without even thinking twice about it, because it was that socially acceptable. And so it really created an environment in which to be a Catholic meant a almost daily conscious choice. I'm going to keep doing this. And it meant on practical levels that most of the time, as a Catholic, Tolkien would be going to churches that were plainer, uglier, simpler than their Anglican counterparts, because all of the existing churches at the Reformation were seized for the new Anglican establishment, leaving Catholics with no buildings. And they were, in fact, not even allowed to build new buildings until the 18th century. So even the physical environment in which Tolkien's worshiping, there's a contrast. I mean, I'll give you one last example. When he was undergraduate at Exeter, he, at this point, still relatively new that Catholics were even allowed to matriculate at Exeter, at Oxford, because the university had, until the 1850s and onward, required all students to assent to the Anglican 39 Articles in order to even begin their studies. Therefore, Catholics were not permitted to attend because they couldn't take that oath. And that had changed by the time that Tolkien arrived, obviously. But his Anglican classmates could go to beautiful churches like the University Church, St. Mary's, loads of options. As a Catholic student, the Catholic chapel was literally in an attic. Was in an attic. And one of the things I'm delighted about in Tolkien's Fate is I managed to track down a photograph of that space, this cramped attic chapel, and it's in the photo gallery and it has never been published before. I don't think it's ever been seen before. So we can actually see this little cramped space in which Tolkien, the undergraduate, would have been going to Mass.
Yeah, the photo gallery is one of the standout things of the book. Your photo gallery for your last book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, was great, but this is even better. You've got over 70 images, many of them in glorious Technicolor. Not that one, of course, because it's all dark and gloomy and cobwebby and cramped. But many other beautiful, helpful illustrations tracing Tolkien's life right through from beginning to end, from his baptism in South Africa all the way through to his burial here in Oxford, where I'm speaking to you from today. So we touched there a little bit upon some of the sort of social disadvantages, the social marginalization that Catholics suffered for centuries from the English Reformation onwards, and they were still, as you just indicated, sometimes rather painfully palpable in just casual conversation. So that was one way in which Tolkien had to, as it were, battle for his faith. It wasn't the socially default setting. It was a minority position, and it was, in many respects, a despised position. He also had lost his parents, both his mother and his father, by the time he was 12. So he's been orphaned. He's got this religiously regrettable position as far as the majority are concerned. And then, of course, he goes through the suffering of the trenches in the Great War. He's a lieutenant, as we say in Britain, a lieutenant in the British Army at the Battle of the Somme. Tell us a little bit about his wartime experiences and how he managed to get through those without losing his faith.
Well, this is such an important question because the Great War, World War I, was culturally just utterly traumatic. It was shattering for worldwide culture, particularly for England. The slaughter was absolutely just tremendous. It was hideous. And there's the amount of suffering that the troops experienced in the trenches. This was the first fully mechanized war. People were being gunned down by machine guns. They were being killed by poison gas and in hideously gruesome ways. And this is such a traumatic experience that it brings up the question of suffering. How can there be a good God who permits these things? And it's interesting to note that a lot of the men in the trenches did lose their faith. We see some of the finest writers of Tolkien's generation, like Robert Graves, abandoned their faith after this testing experience. And C.S. Lewis was an atheist at the time that he was in the Great War, and he came through it still an atheist. He He said, I was terribly frightened, but I never sunk so low as to pray, if I've got the quotation right. So we can see that it was by no means a foregone conclusion that Tolkien would come out of this hideous experience with his faith intact. But he did. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that he was already well acquainted with suffering, having lost his parents. And he had very wise guidance from his guardian and his, what he called the second father, Father Francis Morgan, who was more than just a legal guardian to him. He was genuinely, Tolkien called him his second father. And he would have mentored him and did help him come to terms with the loss, particularly of his mother, which was the shattering event of his childhood. So when he went into World War I, Tolkien had, in a sense, already developed some spiritual muscle, which is helpful. But there are some interesting things we can trace. I mean, one just interesting bit that I turned up on my research is that Tolkien ended up, when he was in the Lancashire Fusiliers, that was actually one of the most Catholic battalions in England. So he had more support from being amongst Catholics than perhaps some of his Anglican, compatriots had in their sort of randomly assorted battalions where people might or might not have a serious Anglican faith. And in the trenches, he seems to have either developed or strengthened his devotion to the Virgin Mary as the Mother of God. And it comes in some particularly interesting ways. He composed a poem, one of which, the titles of which is Consolatrix Afflictorum, which means consoler of the afflicted. And it's a title of Mary that comes from a Catholic prayer called the Litany of Loretto. And I will add that I have an appendix of prayers and liturgical extracts where I put in these things, because there's no reason to expect that you, the reader of Tolkien, know anything about what the Litany of Loretto is, much less have ever seen it. But now you can look in the appendix and you can see it. You can read it. This is something that Tolkien knew well. He knew well enough, and it meant enough to him that he composes a poem about Mary under the title that comes from one of these invocations in the Litany of Loretto. So Mary as consoler of the afflicted is really important for him, suffering in the trenches. He was fighting on the front lines. And he also calls her in this poem, he calls her the evening star, Stella Vespertina. And that sounds like it's another title from the Litany of Loretto, but it's not. In the litany, there is the title of Stella Matutina, the morning star, but Tolkien has done his own creative twist on it. It's Stella Vespertina, the evening star. And there's too much detail to go into about how this ties in specifically to his experience in the trenches, but it does. But I think it already helps us to see he's reflecting on Mary as this figure for consolation in darkness, as the sun is setting, as the sun is going out of sight literally, and also as God the Son, Christ, seems to be going out of sight spiritually. And that is something that he then brings over into his later writings. We see a very sensitive treatment of light and darkness in The Lord of the Rings. Sam has that experience with seeing the evening star. We have Arwen as Arwen and Galadriel, this debate about which one is more beautiful, the morning star, the morning, or the evening. And this again traces back to these images of the archetypal mother, the archetypal woman who is Mary, who in Tolkien's imagination as shaped during the Great War, she is the star who comes in the evening. She's the evening star. And so there's some really interesting ways we see both his faith and his creative imagination developing in the trenches.
Yeah, I found that a really profound and moving part of your discussion of the First World War. Tolkien's Mary and spirituality, because Mary is sometimes described as cause of our joy in that she brings Christ into the world, but she's also the sorrowing mother who stands at the foot of the cross, and she's the one through whose heart the sword goes, as Simeon had prophesied. And so she's the consoler of the afflicted as well, because she knows better than anybody what it is to suffer. But But talking about Mary brings us on to the question of saints more generally, because Tolkien worshipped God, but he venerated the saints. He did not worship Mary, even though he had a very high estimation of her and felt spiritually connected to her through the mystical body of Christ. So talk a little bit about some of the other saints in Tolkien's spirituality. Who occurs that is worth talking about briefly now?
Well, one of them is John, St. John the Evangelist, and Tolkien felt a particular connection to him because of the shared name and because Tolkien's birthday fell within a set of celebrations of the Feast of St. John. And he knew that he hadn't been named after John. It was a family name, but he took him as a kind of patron. And one of the interesting things about John is that this gospel writer has as a symbol the eagle. And it is quite interesting to note that for Tolkien in his later writings, eagles are definitely eucatastrophic images. When the eagles arrive, you know there's going to be a turn for the better. You know, the eagles are coming, and they're rescuing, for instance, Frodo and Sam, or they're helping to bring about the successful conclusion to the Battle of the Five Armies. So that's an imagery of St. John that I think would have been very appealing to Tolkien, who considered him to be a definite patron. But he was also very drawn to a couple of more modern saints. One of them was St. Bernadette, this little French peasant girl who had had a set of visions of the Virgin Mary in Lourdes, France. And he called her the child of grace that was closest to his heart. And I think that's an indication of his humility, that he could resonate with this illiterate peasant girl who, like him, had an appreciation, a love of the beauty of the Virgin Mary. And then another saint that he greatly admired was Thomas More, who, again, even a more recent figure. And Tolkien read a biography of More by his Anglican friend and colleague, R.W. Chambers, and thought so highly of it that he said, I'm going to read it again immediately, and was just really moved by Thomas More's character, by his actions, and I think saw that it was very applicable to his present day, in which at the time he was reading it, the Second World War was rumbling into being. So he was seeing, the Nazi threat overshadowing culture. It's going to be a dark time. It was a dark time. And he saw St. Thomas More as a figure who, was a layman, like Tolkien himself, and had a family, like Tolkien himself, and did his work as best he could. And at the end, though, when he was put to it, he would not turn away from his faith and accepted death instead of it. Now, of course, Tolkien never had to face that kind of dilemma. But I think his interest in Thomas More, I think, shows his sense of, I have to live my faith for real. It's not just an abstract idea.
Yeah. Your mentioning of St. John the Evangelist reminds me of that exchange that Tolkien had with Lewis, C.S. Lewis, when Tolkien, perhaps rather inadvisedly, revealed that he had this devotion to St. John, and Lewis stiffened and said in a rather harsh tone of voice, I can't imagine any two persons more dissimilar, which left Tolkien feeling rather crushed. So let's talk a little bit about Tolkien's relationship with C.S. Lewis, who was one of the most influential people in Tolkien's life. You principally feature four influential persons in Tolkien's life: his mother, Father Francis, his wife Edith, and the fourth of them is C.S. Lewis. And Tolkien played a great part in Lewis coming back to the Christian faith in which he had been raised. Talk a little bit about their important relationship and why it was so crucial for both men, really.
Yeah, I mean, it was a mutually beneficial friendship and a strong one and a lasting one. And I think one important thing to note, too, is that when they first became friends, Lewis was still in his atheist phase, and Tolkien was a Catholic, and this did not stop them from becoming good friends. They bonded over Norse literature, reading the Norse sagas. And Tolkien went so far as to share with Lewis the draft of an unpublished poem, The Lay of Leithian, which is one of the stories that touches on the real heart of the legendarium. It's the story of Beren and Luthien. Deeply personal, and Tolkien could be very shy about his writing, but he takes a step of showing it to his new friend, Lewis, and Lewis responds very warmly and understands Tolkien's sensitivity and gives us really deft and thoughtful and clever commentary on it that seals Tolkien's friendship with him, basically. And this is when Tolkien knew that Lewis was at that point not a believer. And in fact, Lewis had come from a very anti-Catholic background, so he's a bit of an anti-papist atheist, not just a general one. But then as time goes on, Lewis independently starts believing in God, becoming a theist. And you trace some of his thinking there in your book, After Humanity, which I will add everyone should read. If they're interested in Lewis, you have to read After Humanity. It helps you understand the abolition of man, which is brilliant. So he gets to a point where he's believing in God, but he's not a Christian. But a conversation that Lewis had with Tolkien and with another friend of theirs, Hugo Dyson, on Addison's Walk one day, they started talking about the sort of mythic dimension of Christianity. And it seems that Tolkien was particularly helpful in helping Lewis to realize that Christianity wasn't just a set of abstract ideas that you had to assimilate, which he was having trouble with. He knew what Christians believed, but he was finding it very cold and unbelievable. But Tolkien shows him that the Christian story is still a story. It's still a myth. It still has that mythopoetic dimension. But his point is that it's the true myth. The mythic dimension does not conflict with its truth. And that really was the aha moment for Lewis, who very shortly after takes that step and believes in Christ, believes in Christianity. And Tolkien helps him to make that move. And then after that, I think it's natural to think that, Tolkien would have liked his friend to have become a Catholic, but he didn't. He stayed as an Anglican. And Tolkien was fine with that. He's very clear. He says, even to love our Lord and to call him Lord is a grace and may bring more graces. So he's very big-hearted, very generous in recognizing, I would have liked my friend to have come all the way in, but he didn't. He's a Christian. This is good. We are friends. This is good. And they remained friends through various testing circumstances all the way to Lewis's death. It's sometimes mooted that they had a bit of a falling out at the end of their life, but this is really not the case. They had their disagreements, and towards the end of Lewis's life, they didn't see each other as much because they were both extremely busy men. And Lewis had got married at that point and had stepsons. But there was always a great bond of friendship that endured, and they were mutually beneficial because had Tolkien not helped Lewis to become a Christian, we probably wouldn't have books like The Chronicles of Narnia or Mere Christianity. He might not have become a Christian, or he might have done so much later and not written these marvelous books. And Tolkien was very forthright about the tremendous benefit that Lewis had on him, personally, but also literarily. He said that if it were not for Lewis's constant encouragement, carried almost to nagging at times, without Lewis's constant encouragement, Tolkien says he would never have finished The Lord of the Rings. So the fact that we have The Lord of the Rings, we really owe to C.S. Lewis and to that great friendship.
Yeah, it's a great example of how the two worlds that we were earlier talking about, in this instance, aren't chafing against each other harmfully, but actually interacting with each other fruitfully and helpfully. Lewis, when he wrote his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, said that when he first came into the world, he was warned explicitly never to trust a papist. And when he first came into the English faculty at Oxford, he was warned never to trust a philologist. Tolkien was both. So it's surprising in some ways that they did achieve this warm friendship. Philology was a shared interest, their love of language. It wasn't just their love of the Christian faith or their love of myth. And you have a chapter on Tolkien's professional academic career, the academic vocation. But alas, we don't really have time to get into that now. But one other thing we ought to talk about is Tolkien once jokingly said, "I wrote the dictionary." And he did indeed write parts of the Oxford English Dictionary. Yeah, that was part of his early philological career. He wrote the dictionary, but he also wrote the Bible, we might say. Or at any rate, he wrote a translation of the Bible. He participated in the Jerusalem Bible translation project that was published in the 1960s. People don't think of Tolkien as a Bible translator, but he was. This was another important aspect of his faith. Tell us about that.
Well, this is such an interesting aspect of his faith and his work, because up until that point, the idea of a layman like Tolkien, not a priest, not a professional religious, participating in the translation of the Bible was, for Catholics, not a thing. This was new. And this was really part of the shift that started in the 1940s. Pope Pius XII was encouraging Catholics to get involved in better scripture translations, ones that used modern linguistic approaches that really contextualized what the ancient authors were saying. And what the Pope says in this encyclical encouraging this approach to literary texts of the Bible is really what Tolkien excelled at as a professional philologer. He could get into the head of the Old English scribes so thoroughly that he could tell what kind of error they had made. Oh, that must be a misreading, because of course he would actually have been writing such and such. He could really get into their mind and understand that. And that's the kind of skill that was needed for approaching translation. So the Jerusalem Bible was originally in French, a massive project that brought all this new scholarship to bear. And then in the 1960s, they wanted to do an English translation of it. And so one of the very first people that the editor approached was Tolkien. And he would have loved to have had the whole Bible translated by the author of The Lord of the Rings, but he knew that wasn't going to happen. He asked him to translate the Book of Jonah, which Tolkien did, and which Tolkien finished and delivered on time, which, if you know anything about Tolkien's working habits, is really remarkable. And it's this lovely translation, and Tolkien accepted very readily. And I think that's the first interesting thing, because again, this is not the sort of thing that Catholic laymen did at that time. So he's stepping forward into a new kind of engagement with his faith. So that's really interesting. And the translation itself is also intriguing on a couple of notes. One is that he had a discussion with the editor about the language that they would use and whether they should use thee and thou, the sort of older archaic language, or use you and your, the more modern. And Tolkien weighed in, saying we should use the more modern version. We should use you and your. And the editor came back and said, well, I'm glad you weighed in because I wasn't sure. And this is so interesting because we might assume that Tolkien, with his interest in medieval literature and older literature, of course he would prefer the older language. But he understood that you needed to reach the reader and that this language for this Bible translation was better to use the more modern form. And because the editor was on the fence, Tolkien could, I think, have convinced him the other way if he had tried. So he really tipped over the balance to use the more modern forms in the translation. And the other kind of really charming note is that Tolkien spent ages researching what the name of a certain plant is in the Book of Jonah, as he did because he's Tolkien, and came up with colocynth. But sadly, the editors did not use that in the final version. Poor Tolkien.
Yes, the gourd, the castor oil plant that grows up over Jonah. Yes, a colocynth or colocynth, however you say it. I've never heard anyone pronounce it before today. Yeah, and then there's also that lovely bit where when Jonah gets thrown overboard before he's swallowed by the great fish, we're told that the seaweed was wrapped around his head down at the roots of the mountains. Tell us about that. Phrase.
That phrase caught my eye because after having written Tolkien's Modern Reading, where I'm looking at his his influence from William Morris, who had a book called The Roots of the Mountains. That phrase is a very distinctive phrase. It's rendered in a way that he's not getting it from any other translation, the plural, at the roots of the mountains. And that is where Gollum lives in Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit. He has his caves at the roots of the mountains. So it's delightful to think that in translating for the Jerusalem Bible, he reaches for a phrase that he had used in The Hobbit. And so we have essentially a bit from The Hobbit has made its way into the Bible, which is just delightful.
Excellent. There's so much more we could say. We haven't even talked about the Waybread. There's another example of how one of Tolkien's own coinages gets into the dictionary. People will have to read your book to find out more about that. We're nearly at the end. I think this should probably be the last question. There's so much in this book. It's a 500-page massive biography with photo gallery and appendices and glossary, and we could have talked for hours, days, about all that you have discovered. What is there for you personally that sticks out? What have you found most interesting or unexpected or valuable?
I think for me, what has really struck me has been the overall theme of how hard-won his faith was. Because when I went into this, I knew he was a devout Christian. I knew he was a devout Catholic. But I had the basic premise that he was pretty much going on an even keel throughout his life. And I had read remarks in his letters that would have disrupted that, but I hadn't really put them in their proper context or thought through them until I did this book. And I was really struck that his faith life was full of difficulties and speed bumps, you might say. He lapsed a little bit in his practice as an undergraduate, not in his belief, but he became, as he called it himself, slack in his practices. He goes through a phase after the war in which, by his own account, for some years, he says, I almost ceased to practice my religion. He struggled with things. He grappled with them. And he did so consciously and deliberately and intentionally through his whole life. And therefore, the story of his faith turned out, as I realized, to be one it's a story of growth. So far from being a simple emotional attachment to, his mother, that wouldn't have brought him through the Great War. It wouldn't have brought him through all the testing experience that he had. He did have an emotional attachment to it, but that was only one factor in a very, very multifaceted picture. And that faith grew and developed and made its way into his life in all sorts of remarkable ways. I was, for instance, struck, we didn't have time to talk about this, but by the way that he was very public as a Catholic in his academic context at Oxford. And he didn't have to be. In fact, the pressure would have been for him not to be, but he chose to be very active. And he was, for instance, a member of the National Newman Association, which was an England-wide association for the promotion of Catholicism amongst university graduates. That's just one tiny example of the way that he's continually putting this into practice as an academic, as a professional, and in his everyday life, through a lot of trials and difficulties. The Great War, the Second World War, he had two sons serving in the war, all the turmoil of Vatican II and the changes of the modern world. He grappled with it, he discussed it, and he held firm to his faith, and he grew in his faith, even to the very end of his life. And that, to me, was really remarkable and unexpected, and I thought very interesting and really deeply moving.
Yes, absolutely. There are many moving aspects to this account as you portray it. You mentioned Newman just then. Perhaps that's a nice note on which to end, because Newman had founded the Birmingham Oratory. One of the priests at the Birmingham Oratory, Francis Morgan, had even served as Newman's secretary for a bit and knew him well. You include a photograph in which both men appear. And then Francis Morgan effectively becomes a second father to Tolkien. So you go to Newman, Morgan, Tolkien. There's a not wholly unwarranted ground for claiming that Tolkien was the grandson Newman never had. And that's just a beautiful thought in itself for anybody who knows and loves Newman's work. So I think that's a beautiful sort of cherry on the top of the cake that we can put as we draw things to a close. So thank you very much, Holly, and congratulations on this excellent book. Tolkien's Faith, a Spiritual Biography, is published by Word on Fire Academic in late August 2023 to mark the 50th anniversary of Tolkien's death. It's excellent. Everybody should read it. Catholic, Christian, whatever you are, as long as you have an interest in Tolkien, you'll find this book illuminating, interesting, and I think important. It's going to contribute mightily to the field of Tolkien scholarship. So thank you again, and goodbye.
Thank you.